we consider the simplex method for solving a linear programming problem. And we want to look at a maximization problem. Z is equals to 3x1 plus x2 plus 3x3. Subject to x1 minus x2 plus x3 is less than or equals to 5. 2x1 plus 3x2 minus x3 is less than or equals to 3. 3x1 plus x2 plus x3 is less than or equals to 11, with x1, x2, and x3 greater than or equals to 0, meaning that they are non-negative values that we'll be looking for. So we want to write our linear programming problem in standard form. And so we are going to maximize z is equals to 3x1 plus x2 plus 3x3, subject to x1 minus x2 plus x3 plus s1 is equals to 5. And what you have introduced here is what we'll call the slack variable. And then we have 2x1 plus 3x2 minus s3 plus s2 is equals to 3. And that is our second slack variable. And then we have 3x1 plus x2 plus x3 plus s3 is equals to 11. And so our third slack variable is s3. So with xi, si, they are all greater than or equals to 0. And that means I is equals to 1, 2, and 3. We want to write this in matrix form, and then we'll be able to continue and solve the problem. So for our matrix, which we have written down, on the left-hand side of S1, S2, and S3 are our slack variables. Then we have X1, X2, X3, S1, S2, and S3. And based on the data that we had, it was x1 minus x2 plus x3 plus s1 is equals to 5. Then it was 2x1 plus 3x2 minus x3 plus s2 is equals to 3. And then the last one was 3x1 plus x2 plus x3 plus s3 is equals to 11. Where did I get negative 3, negative 1, and negative 3? It is z minus the cj's, the values that you have in objective function. So z minus 3. So this is negative 3x1. So under the column of x1, x2, and x3. So after that, the next step is we look for the highest negative value on the last row of the matrix. And I find that these are the two. But I'm going to deal with this one because this one, all are numbers here, 1, negative 1, and 1. And now what do we do next? We take 5, we divide by 1. 5 divided by 1 is 5. Then I take 3 divided by negative 1 is negative 3. And then 11 divided by 1 is 11. So why am I interested in this? Because I'm getting these ratios to find the lowest. Between these three, 5, negative 3, and 11, 5 is the smallest. I don't want to deal with a negative. So I'm going to pick this value to be very important to me. What does that mean? This becomes the pivot element, and x3 becomes the pivot column. So all the operations I'm going to do in reducing the rows of the matrix, I'll be basing everything on that. So I'm going to create another matrix that I'll make all the entries below 1. First of all, 1 will remain 1. If it was more than 1, I would have reduced it. And then anything below 1, negative 1, I want to make it 0. And 1, I want to make it 0 using what we call the row reduction process. So what we see is that the first row, nothing much changes. The only thing that is going to change is this. I'm going to replace S1 with the pivot column, which becomes my x3. But everything else I've divided through by 1 because this is a pivot element. This one here. I've divided through by 1 and everything else remains as it was. Now I want to make sure that this becomes 0. So what do? I'll just take 1 plus -1. So I'll just be taking the first row plus the second row, and then I'll be getting the total. This becomes 3, this becomes 2, that becomes 0, that becomes 1, 1, 0, and 8 because it was 5 plus 3. Here it was 0 plus 1, which is 1. Here it was 1 plus 0 in the previous matrix, and that becomes 1. How do you know? So I take the first row, I make it negative, and then I add to the second. So -1 times -1, which is 1, then plus 1, which is 2. Then -1 plus 3, this remains 2. And then -1 plus 0, which is -1. -0 plus 1 is 1. And then -5 plus 11, which will give me 6. Remember, there was a -3 here, so I multiply the pivot element times 3. Then I add there, and that becomes 0. If I multiply this by 3, that is -3. And -1, that gives me -4. This is this is 3 plus -3, that becomes 0. This is 3 plus 0, that becomes 3. And everything else becomes 0. This is 5 times 3, which is 15. Yes, to make me the matrix that I'll get. Now we see that we have also a negative value down here. And this is where our interest is, z minus cj. So again, I'm going to divide through to find the smallest ratio. 5 over -1 is -5. 8 over 2 is 4. And 6 over 2 is 3. Yes, I'm using this column. That becomes my pivot element. Why? Because it gives me the smallest ratio here of 3. Remember, I'm looking at the positive because my values should be positive. This is a pivot element. And this is 2. So what does that mean? It means that we need to make 2 to become a 1. So we divide through everything by 2 so that my pivot element remains as a unit. And then I'm going to replace S3 with X2. What I have now is I've divided S3, which I have replaced with X2 because X2 is my pivot column. I have divided through by a half, and that is what I got. So every other element on top of it should be 0. So I'll start off by making this 0. So these two are negative, and then I add 3, I get 1. I make this 0 a negative, I add to 0, it remains 0. And then I make this a negative, which is 1 plus 1, that gives me 2. This is 0 plus 1. And this is 1, and it's -1 plus 0, which becomes -1. So if I make 6 a negative, and I add to that to 8, I'll get 2 in the previous matrix. So that is what we have. In the last step here, I want to make this 0. So I take 2 times a half times 2 plus -1 will give me 0. Then a half times 2 is 1 plus 1, which will give me 2. Remember, we use the entries of the previous to be able to do what we are doing. This is being multiplied by a half. 0 times a half is 0 plus 1 is 1. And then -1 times a half is a negative a half plus 1, which will give me a half. This is 0, and here it will also be 0. And then this is 1 times a half. 1 times a half is a half, and then plus 0 is a half. So 6 times a half is 3. 3 plus 5 is 8. And then on the lower side, we want to make the entry 0. So here I multiply by 2 plus 4. That gives me 0. By 2 is 4 plus 0 is 4. 0 times 2 plus that is 0. Negative 1 times 2 is negative 2 plus 3 gives me 1. And then 0 times 2 is 0. And then 1 times 2 is 2. And then 6 times 2 is 12. 6 times 2 is 12 plus 15 is equals to 27. And star will be equals to 27. X3 is 8. X2 is equals to 3. And S2 is equals to 2. So it means that S1 is equals to S3 is equals to X1 is equals to 0. And that will be the final solution for that.